There is a question that has never been answered in any courtroom, any Senate hearing, or any official report. If you hand someone a tool that gets them arrested, were you helping them or were you using them? She didn't know who sent the box. She didn't ask. In Tehran, in January 2026, you learn not to ask. You learn to read signals, a knock at a certain hour, a package left in a stairwell, a phone number that appears once and never again. You learn that the people who help you are often people you will never be able to thank, because thanking them would require knowing them, and knowing them would get you both killed. The box was flat, lighter than she expected. Inside was a white dish, a cable, a rotor, and a sheet of paper folded so many times it had worn soft at the edges. The instructions were in Farsi. Clean, printed Farsi, not handwritten, not rushed. Someone had taken time with this. She had no way of knowing that the paper in her hands had passed through at least 4 countries before reaching her apartment. She had no way of knowing that 18 months of planning, 2 intelligence agencies, and approximately $40 million in diverted U.S. State Department funds had gone into making sure that box reached her specifically, in that building, in that city, in that week. She plugged it in, stepped back, go back further. Because this story doesn't begin in January 2026. It begins with a kill switch. The Islamic Republic of Iran spent the better part of 2 decades building something that most governments only dream about: a national internet that it could turn off. Not slow down, not censor, off. A parallel digital infrastructure called the National Information Network, built on Iranian servers, running through Iranian cables, governed by Iranian law, answerable to no one outside the country's borders. The stated reason, the public reason, was sovereignty. Iran didn't want its communications infrastructure dependent on American companies, vulnerable to American surveillance. That argument had a logic to it. It still does, if you're being honest. But the real function of a kill switch is not sovereignty, it is silence. In 2019, when Iranians took to the streets over a sudden fuel price hike, the regime threw the switch. For 5 days, Iran went dark. The IRGC deployed. People died. Estimates range from 1,500 to over 7,000, depending on whose count you trust. The world didn't see any of it in real time. There were no viral videos, no live streams, no desperate calls going out to diaspora relatives. Just silence. That silence was not a side effect of the blackout. It was the point. Now move forward. June 2025. Israel and Iran fight what analysts would later call the 12-day war. A conflict compressed so tight it barely had time to acquire a name before it ended. Missiles, drones, counterstrikes, a negotiated ceasefire brokered under pressure. And in the middle of it, something strange. Elon Musk posts on X, Starlink beams are on over Iran. Within 48 hours, Iranian signals intelligence units begin logging something they had never seen at scale before. Tens of thousands of unauthorized satellite uplinks emerging from inside the country. Not from military installations, not from government buildings, from apartments, rooftops, basements. The IRGC's Electronic Warfare Division takes note. They run exercises. They test their jamming protocols against Starlink's specific frequency bands. They bring in Russian technical advisors, men who had spent 2 years studying how Ukraine used Starlink against Russian forces and had learned the hard way exactly what it took to beat it. Iran files this information. They wait. They know the next time Starlink activates over Iran, it won't be an accident. And in Washington, in a building without a public address, a woman named Mora Namdar is writing a memo. She is a State Department official. Her name doesn't appear on cable news. She doesn't give press conferences. She operates in the part of American foreign policy that exists in the gap between what is said publicly and what is done quietly. Her memo, addressed to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, makes a single argument with the clarity of someone who has been thinking about it for a long time. The next time Iran's streets fill with people, she writes, the regime will cut the internet within hours. That blackout will determine whether the movement lives or dies. If protesters can communicate, they can coordinate. If they can coordinate, they can sustain. If they can sustain, the world watches. And if the world watches, the calculation inside the regime changes. The tool she recommends is Starlink. The budget she requests comes from funds originally earmarked for other internet freedom initiatives that are quietly deprioritized to free up the money. The memo is approved. What the memo does not address, what no memo could address cleanly, is a risk that sits at the center of the entire plan like a splinter that can't be removed without making the wound worse. To get Starlink terminals into Iran, you need a supply chain. Supply chains have people in them. People can be found, people can be arrested, people can be interrogated. And in Iran, interrogation is not a process governed by rules that would be recognizable to anyone raised on Western legal principles. The people in that supply chain, the couriers, the distributors, the warehouse operators, many of them will not be intelligence assets. Many of them will not even know what they're carrying. They will be what the intelligence community calls, in language designed to drain the moral weight out of the situation, unwitting facilitators. The memo doesn't have a column for what happens to unwitting facilitators when the operation is exposed. It has a column for terminal deployment rates. It has a column for projected network uptime. It does not have a column for that. The terminals begin moving before the protests begin. This is important. This is one of the most important details in the entire operation, and it is also one of the most uncomfortable. The Starlink network being built inside Iran is not a response to the January 2026 crisis. It is preparation for it, which means that someone, somewhere, looked at an Iranian economy in freefall, a rial that had lost 60% of its value, a population where 40% lived below the poverty line, a regime whose domestic legitimacy was held together with fear and fuel subsidies, and made a prediction. They predicted the breaking point before the breaking point arrived, and they built infrastructure for it, in advance. This is what foreign policy professionals call contingency preparation. It is also, depending on where you stand, something else entirely, the construction of conditions designed to turn a domestic crisis into something more useful to outside interests. The terminals move through Turkey, across mountain corridors that have been used by Kurdish traders for generations. They move through the UAE, repackaged in commercial electronics boxes, waved through by customs officials whose motivations remain unclear. They move through Afghanistan, along routes that were built for other operations and repurposed for this one. And some of them move through Iranian businessmen who have no idea what they're importing. A man in Isfahan, a distributor in Tabriz, a logistics operator in Ahvaz whose company has handled electronics shipments for years, who has no reason to suspect that this shipment is anything other than what the paperwork says it is. He moves the boxes. He goes home. He does not know that somewhere in Tel Aviv, his name does not appear in any file. Not because he's been protected, because he's been rendered invisible to the people who set this chain in motion. He is a gap in the record, a blind spot in the architecture. And blind spots in intelligence operations have a way of being filled, not by the people who created them, but by the people hunting for them. By December 2025, the rial collapses. Not gradually, not in the slow bleed of a managed decline. It falls off a cliff. 60% of its value gone in weeks. Iranians who had savings wake up to find that those savings mean something between a third and a half of what they meant before. The streets begin to fill, And in a building somewhere, in Langley, in Tel Aviv, in Washington, someone opens a folder. The plan is ready. The terminals are positioned. The network exists, waiting to be activated. The only question, the question that hangs over everything that is about to happen, is this: who exactly will pay the cost of turning it on? There is a version of this story where the Starlink operation is a clean act of conscience. A superpower sees a population being silenced. It hands them a tool. It asks nothing in return. It steps back. That version is easier to tell. It is also not the version that happened. The terminals that entered Iran were not charity, they were infrastructure. And infrastructure, in intelligence work, is never built for one purpose. It is built to serve the operation that's visible and the operations that come after, the ones that aren't announced, the ones that don't appear in memos addressed to secretaries of state. To understand this, you need to understand what a Starlink terminal actually is in the context of a covert operation. It is not simply a dish that connects to the sky. It is a device with a fixed hardware identity, a unique identifier that, if you know what you're looking for, allows you to track every upload, every connection, every moment of activity tied to that specific unit. The people who manufactured those terminals knew their identifiers. The people who procured them knew their identifiers. The intelligence services coordinating their distribution knew their identifiers. Which means that from the moment a terminal was activated inside Iran, someone outside Iran, in a facility with the right equipment and the right access, could see exactly where it was, what it was transmitting, and when. This is not a bug in the operation. It was a feature. In Tel Aviv, in the weeks before the January 2026 protests broke open, a team of Mossad signals analysts had been running what they internally referred to as a mapping exercise. The terminals being distributed across Iran were not going randomly. They were going to specific people in specific locations, people who had been assessed, through years of cultivated intelligence networks, as protest-connected, regime-opposed, and operationally useful. Activists, journalists, former political prisoners who had been released and were now, quietly, rebuilding networks. Neighborhood organizers. University students who had been on watch lists since 2022. These were the people the terminals were going to. And by giving them the terminals, the operation did two things simultaneously. It gave them a voice, and it told Mossad exactly where they were. This is the fracture point in the operation that no public report has examined directly. The individuals receiving the terminals were not informed of this dynamic. They were not told that the device being handed to them was, by its nature, visible to the people who had sent it. They were not asked whether they consented to being mapped, tracked, and incorporated into an intelligence picture that served interests extending far beyond their own survival. They were given a box. They were given instructions. They were told it was a tool for freedom. All of that was true. None of it was complete. Inside the operation, there were people who raised this. Not loudly, not in a way that made it into any record that is publicly accessible. But the conversations happened because they always happen, in the small hours before operations of this scale go live, when the people who have built the machine are sitting with the fact of what the machine actually does. One concern was specific. It came from an analyst, not a decision maker, not someone with authority to halt anything, but someone whose job it was to think about second and third order consequences. The concern was this: the terminal mapping gives us visibility into the protest network in real time. That is genuinely valuable for protecting the network. If we see a cluster go dark suddenly, we know that location has been compromised and we can warn adjacent nodes. That is the legitimate use of this capability. But the same map that lets us protect the network also tells us, with precision, who the most active nodes are, who is uploading the most content, who is coordinating across the widest range of contacts, who, in the language of network analysis, is the most central and therefore the most irreplaceable to the movement structure. And that information has a second use that no one in the room wanted to name out loud. It tells you who to approach, who to develop, who, with the right pressure at the right moment, might become something more than a protester with a satellite dish. The analyst put it plainly. We are building a recruitment map while we tell these people we are giving them a communications tool. There was a silence in the room. Then the conversation moved on. The abort discussion happened once. Only once. And it was not triggered by ethics. It was triggered by exposure risk. In late November 2025, one of the distribution routes, the one running through the UAE, showed signs of compromise. A shipment had been delayed at customs in a way that didn't match the normal pattern. Two names in the logistics chain had appeared independently in IRGC intelligence intercepts that Mossad had access to through a source whose identity remains one of the most closely held secrets in current Israeli intelligence. The question on the table was simple: do we pause? The argument for pausing was operational. If that route was compromised, then everything that had moved through it was potentially visible to Iranian intelligence. The people who had received those terminals were potentially already on a list. Continuing the operation would not protect them. It would expand the list. The argument against pausing was strategic, and it was made by someone with more authority than the people raising the concern. The protests are coming, not in months, in weeks. If we pause the distribution now, we lose the window. The terminals already inside Iran are already there. Pausing doesn't make them disappear. It only means the people who need them in the next phase don't get them. And then the argument that ended the discussion: the people on the compromised route are already exposed. Pausing the operation doesn't unexpose them. It only means we pulled back for nothing. The operation did not pause. The terminals kept moving. Here is the assumption that Phase 1 built carefully and that needs to be broken now. The assumption is that this operation was designed to help Iranian protesters. That is what the memo said. That is what the public record reflects. That is the frame through which every Western news outlet has reported it. It is not wrong, but it is not the whole architecture. The Starlink operation was layered. On the surface, terminals, communications, protest support. That layer was real. People used those terminals. Footage was uploaded. The world watched things it would otherwise never have seen. But underneath that layer was a second operation that ran parallel to the first. The distribution network being built inside Iran, the couriers, the safe houses, the trusted intermediaries, was also a Mossad penetration network. Every link in the chain that had been recruited with knowledge was a potential long-term asset. Every location that had been identified as a reliable distribution point was a location that now existed in Mossad's operational geography of Iran. The protest support operation was building, simultaneously, the infrastructure for whatever came next. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is how layered intelligence operations work. You don't build a network of this scale, at this cost, for a single use case. You build it to last. You build it to serve multiple objectives across multiple timelines. The Iranian protesters who received those terminals were genuinely being helped. That is true. They were also, without knowing it, being used to build something that would outlast their movement, regardless of whether their movement succeeded or failed. Both of these things were designed into the operation from the beginning. And then December comes. The reel finishes collapsing. The streets fill faster than even the most aggressive internal projections had anticipated. The scale of the protests surprises everyone, including, reportedly, the teams that had spent 18 months preparing for them. Because here is what no intelligence assessment fully modeled: when you build infrastructure for a revolution, you do not control the revolution that uses it. The people taking to the streets in January 2026 were not following a script written in Washington or Tel Aviv. They were following the logic of their own exhaustion, decades of it, compressed into weeks by an economic collapse that had finally made the cost of silence feel greater than the cost of speaking. They used the terminals. They uploaded the footage. They coordinated in ways that the operation had hoped they would, and they also did things the operation hadn't planned for. They pushed further than the network was designed to sustain. They took risks that no external team had assessed as acceptable. They made decisions about when to march, where to gather, which streets to hold, that were entirely their own. The operation had given them a tool. It had not given them, and could not give them, the ability to control what that tool would be used for. And somewhere in that gap, between what was planned and what was chosen, lives a question that the operation's architects are still sitting with. Did the terminals make the protesters more capable? Yes. Did that capability make them more visible to the very forces trying to destroy them? Also, yes. And if the answer to both questions is yes, if the tool that amplified the movement also amplified the target it painted on everyone in it, then what, exactly, was handed to that woman in the apartment? Was it a lifeline? Or was it something that looked exactly like a lifeline from the outside, but had a different name when viewed from the inside of Evan Prison? The operation is still running. She is still waiting for an answer. The first terminals were activated on January 8, 2026. Not all of them, not even most of them. A test cluster, 43 devices across 6 cities, each one held by someone who had been assessed as reliable, experienced with risk, and unlikely to panic. The activation was silent. No announcement, no signal to the broader network. Just 43 dishes pointing at a sky that, for once, answered back. For 11 hours, the test cluster held. Upload speeds were low, but functional. Encrypted messaging apps that had been dark for 72 hours came back to life. 3 videos were uploaded: a burning car in Mossad, a crowd in Shiraz moving through tear gas, a man in Tehran who looked directly into the camera and said, in Farsi, "We are still here." That video reached 140,000 views before Tehran's DPI filters identified the upload signature. 11 hours. Then the first node went dark. The team monitoring the activation from outside Iran logged the shutdown and called it a localized interference event. Equipment issue. Environmental factor. Not a counter-operation. This was the first incorrect assumption playing out in real time. It was not equipment. It was not environmental. The IRGC's Signals Intelligence Division had been running passive monitoring on Starlink frequencies since June 2025. The moment those 43 terminals activated, a flag was raised. Not publicly, not loudly. The flag went to a unit that had been sitting for 7 months, waiting for exactly this signal. The outside team didn't know this. They had assessed Iran's jamming capability as reactive, capable of responding to a known activation, but not capable of identifying a test cluster this small, this distributed, this quickly. That assessment was built on data from 2024. The Russian technical transfers had happened in late 2024 and early 2025. The data was old, the capability was new, and the gap between those two facts was about to cost the operation something it couldn't recover. The full activation was scheduled for January 14th. On January 12th, one of the ground coordinators inside Iran, a man whose name appears in no file but whose role was to manage distribution in the Tehran corridor, sent a message through a back channel that had been established for exactly this kind of communication. The message was short. Translated, it said, "Something is wrong on the eastern routes. 2 contacts unreachable. 1 location confirmed raided, unclear if Starlink related. Request delay." The message reached the operational team. It was discussed. The discussion lasted 4 hours. The argument for delay was straightforward. 2 unreachable contacts and a raided location, even if unrelated to the operation, meant the exposure surface was larger than the last assessment had shown. Activating 6,000 terminals into a compromised network didn't strengthen the network. It illuminated it. The argument against delay was the same argument it always was. The protests are now, not in 2 weeks. Now. The window isn't a planning variable, it is closing while we are sitting in this room. And then someone said something that ended the debate in the way that debates in operational planning rooms often end, not with consensus, not with resolution, but with the weight of a single reframe dropping onto the table. If we delay, he said, we are making a decision that these people face what is coming without the tools we promised them. We don't get to make that decision from here. The activation was not delayed. January 14th, full network live. For the first 48 hours, the operation felt to everyone monitoring from the outside like a success. The volume of uploads coming out of Iran exceeded every projection. Footage that would have been impossible to capture and transmit during previous crackdowns was now reaching international media within hours of events occurring. The diaspora networks that had been coordinating from London and Los Angeles and Toronto were suddenly in near real-time contact with people on the ground. There was a moment, documented in the after-action assessments that have partially surfaced, where the monitoring team logged what they called a network stability event, a phrase that was, in the dry language of classified reporting, the closest thing to relief that professional language allows. It felt like it was working. This was the false release moment, and it lasted almost exactly 36 hours. On January 16th, the IRGC deployed its mobile jamming units, not from fixed positions. That was the mistake everyone had planned against. Fixed jamming is predictable, mappable, avoidable. These units moved. Trucks, operating on rotating patrol patterns across Tehran's districts, each one carrying equipment capable of targeting Starlink's Q-band frequencies with enough precision to degrade a terminal within a 300-meter radius. The network didn't go dark all at once. That would have been, in a strange way, easier to respond to. Instead, it frayed. Nodes dropped and came back. Upload attempts timed out mid-transmission. Encrypted messages sent from one part of the city arrived, fragmented, delayed, or not at all. And the protesters who had, for 36 hours, been operating with the confidence of people who believed they had a reliable communications infrastructure, began making decisions based on information that was no longer accurate. A march was coordinated for a meeting point in the Engelab district. The coordination happened over the network. By the time the messages were sent, the jamming truck had moved. By the time the messages were received, it had moved again. The march gathered at a location that had been assessed on the basis of 30 minutes of connectivity as clear. It was not clear. The IRGC had been watching the coordination happen. They had read enough of it, not all of it, but enough to know where people were going. 63 people were arrested in the Engelab district on the night of January 16th. Inside the operation, nobody knew this yet. What they knew was that the network was degrading. What they knew was that the jamming had arrived faster and was proving more adaptive than the pre-operation modeling had predicted. There was a near abort. It wasn't framed as an abort, it was framed as a tactical pause for reassessment. Same thing. Different language for the same acknowledgement that the situation on the ground had diverged from the situation in the plan. The pause was proposed by the signals team, who had been watching packet loss climb past 60% in Tehran and were now flagging that the terminals in their current degraded state were doing something worse than providing no communications. They were providing unreliable communications, which meant people were making decisions on the basis of information that felt verified but wasn't. Unreliable intelligence in a protest environment is more dangerous than no intelligence. People trust what comes through a channel they believe is secure. When that channel is partially compromised, they trust compromised information with the same confidence they would place in clean information. The near abort lasted 6 hours. It was not executed. The decision, again, came down to the same wall. We cannot pull this back without telling people we are pulling it back. And telling people we are pulling it back requires admitting to them that we exist. And admitting that we exist ends the entire architecture of deniability that the operation runs on. They couldn't pause. Not without exposing everything. so they kept the network live, degraded, partially compromised, functioning just enough to feel like it was functioning. There's a particular kind of misjudgment that intelligence operations are most vulnerable to. It is not the misjudgment of facts. Facts can be corrected, updated, reassessed. It is the misjudgment of what people will do when they feel capable. The operational planning had modeled protesters with communications tools. It had not modeled what protesters with communications tools, who then lose those tools suddenly and partially, would do in the gap. The answer, it turned out, was that they pushed harder, because for 36 hours they had felt the difference between invisibility and visibility, between silence and being heard. And when that was taken, partially, unevenly, in the grinding, degraded way that jamming takes things rather than the clean way that a switch takes them, they didn't retreat. They went looking for the signal. They moved to rooftops. They moved to higher ground. They clustered near locations that had, hours earlier, shown stronger connectivity. They gathered in the places where the network had last been strongest. The operation had given them the instinct to chase the signal. It had not told them that chasing the signal was exactly what the jamming units were designed to make them do. Whether anyone in the planning room had modeled this possibility, whether it had been raised and dismissed, or raised and buried, or never raised at all, is a question that the after-action reports do not answer. What the after-action reports do show is the locations where arrests clustered most heavily in the third week of January 2026. They were the same locations where Starlink signal strength had been highest. The fallout didn't begin when the operation ended. It began on January 19th, while the network was still partially live, while terminals were still transmitting, while people in Washington and Tel Aviv were still logging uptime statistics and calling the degraded connectivity a sustained partial success. On that day, Iranian state television ran a segment, not about the protests, not about the IRGC crackdowns, about boxes. A table was shown, covered with flat white dishes still in their original packaging, a SpaceX branding visible. A uniformed IRGC intelligence officer stood beside the table and read from a prepared statement. The devices, he said, had been sent by the American Zionist enemy as tools of espionage and foreign-backed sedition. The people who had distributed them and the people who had received them were not protesters. They were agents of a foreign conspiracy against the Islamic Republic. The framing was deliberate. It was also, from a certain angle, not entirely false. And that was the problem. The arrests that followed were not surgical. They were not limited to people who had knowingly participated in the distribution network. The IRGC's approach to the dragnet was architectural. They followed the supply chain backward, from terminal to courier to intermediary to warehouse to importer, and they arrested at every node, regardless of what the person at that node had or hadn't known. The businessman in Isfahan who had moved the electronics shipment without knowing what it contained, he had been flagged in November, before the operation fully activated. The decision not to warn him, not to extract him, not to even acknowledge that he existed as a vulnerability in the chain, that decision, made in the name of operational security, had left him exactly where he was when the IRGC came to his door. He was arrested on January 21st. His wife was brought in for questioning the following week. His name does not appear in any Western intelligence file as a recruited asset. He is not eligible for the protections, inadequate as they are, that are sometimes extended to people who knowingly serve foreign intelligence services. He is, in the precise language of the operation that used him, an unwitting facilitator. In the precise language of the Iranian judicial system, he is a spy. By the end of January, Iranian intelligence had announced the dismantling of what they called multiple foreign-linked espionage networks. The IRGC claimed hundreds of terminal seizures. Evin Prison's intake processing, according to sources close to Iranian human rights organizations, was running at a pace that had not been seen since 2019. And in the specific corridors where the Starlink network had been most active, the locations where signal strength had been highest, where protesters had gathered to find connectivity, the arrest density was measurably, documentably higher than in adjacent areas. This data point was not published. It was observed internally, logged in assessments that will remain classified for decades, and then the conversation moved on. Because the operation was still technically live. Because there were still terminals transmitting. Because the metrics still showed a network, degraded, fractured, hunted, that had not fully collapsed. The Islamic Republic did not fall. This requires stating plainly, without softening. Because the entire operation, the 18 months of planning, the $40 million, the supply chains through 4 countries, the unwitting facilitators, the arrested distributors, the protesters who chased signals to their own arrests, all of it was premised on the possibility that it might. It didn't. The protests of January 2026 were the largest Iran had seen since 1979 by some measurements. They were also, by February 2026, largely suppressed. The regime that the operation was designed to pressure was still in place. The kill switch infrastructure that the terminals were designed to bypass was still in place. The IRGC units that had arrested people in Starlink signal clusters were still in place, and they were now considerably more experienced in countering satellite communications networks than they had been 4 weeks earlier. Iran had, in the words of one analysis that circulated in European intelligence circles, been given a live fire exercise in defeating Starlink at national scale, and it had passed. That capability now exists. It will exist for the next crisis, and the crisis after that. The strategic consequence that received the least coverage was also the most durable. The distribution network built inside Iran, the couriers, the safe houses, the trusted intermediaries who had knowingly participated, had been the most significant penetration of Iranian civil society by Western intelligence in a generation. By February 2026, a significant portion of that network was compromised. People who had taken years to cultivate, relationships that had been built through painstaking patient intelligence work across multiple administrations, assets who had never been burned, who had survived previous crackdowns, who had been assessed as long-term sustainable. Some of them were arrested. Some went silent in ways that suggested voluntary withdrawal from contact. Some were publicly identified by Iranian state media in a campaign that appeared designed not just to prosecute them, but to permanently discredit the concept of civil society cooperation with outside groups. The network that the Starlink operation had built was also partly the network it had destroyed. And Mossad's position inside Iran, which had been, by most external assessments, the most sophisticated foreign intelligence presence operating in any adversary state, was visibly degraded. The June 2025 war had already forced a restructuring of human intelligence networks inside the country. The Starlink operation had, in the name of supporting the protest movement, required activating portions of those networks at a pace and scale that peacetime tradecraft would never have sanctioned. Assets that should have lasted a decade were burned in a month. The after-action assessment of this cost, conducted internally, never published, is reported to have produced significant institutional friction between the elements of Israeli intelligence that had pushed for aggressive activation and the elements that had argued for preservation. That friction did not resolve cleanly. It rarely does. Mora Namdar's memo had been approved. The operation had proceeded. By the official metrics, it had achieved a significant portion of its stated objectives: terminals deployed, network activated, footage documented, international attention secured. This is what the record shows. What the record does not show is the conversation that reportedly happened in a secure facility in late February 2026, when the scope of the Iranian dragnet had become clear, and the question of the unwitting facilitators could no longer be deferred. A decision had to be made about whether to attempt any form of acknowledgement, assistance, or extraction for the people who had moved boxes without knowing what was in them. The answer, shaped by the same architecture of deniability that had governed every other decision in the operation, was, we cannot acknowledge them without acknowledging the operation. We cannot assist them without creating a trail that leads back to the operation. We cannot tell their families anything without breaking the deniability that protects everything else. The people who had been used without knowledge would be left to navigate consequences they had never been warned about, for an operation they had never agreed to participate in. This is not a unique outcome in the history of covert operations. It is, in fact, a recurring one. The intelligence community has a long institutional relationship with this kind of cost. It has procedures for processing it, language for containing it, systems for ensuring that the people who made the decisions that created it are not required to sit with it in any sustained way. The word for all of this is deniability. And deniability is load-bearing in operations of this kind. Remove it, and the entire architecture collapses, which means the people inside the architecture are required structurally to maintain it, even when maintaining it means leaving someone in a prison cell in Tehran who doesn't know why they're there. The footage from January 2026 is still online. All of it, the burning cars, the crowds, the man who looked into the camera and said we are still here. It has been viewed hundreds of millions of times. It has been cited in human rights reports. It has been submitted as evidence in international proceedings. It is, in the most direct sense, a historical record of what the Iranian regime does to its own people. It exists because of those terminals. The woman who uploaded the burning street, the one from the cold open, the one who had 40 minutes between connection and arrest, her footage is in that record. She is still in Evin prison. Both of these things are true. If the story of the people left inside that operation matters to you, and it should regardless of where you stand on everything else, the journalists and organizations tracking Iranian political prisoners need the same thing those protesters needed: attention, documentation, the knowledge that someone is watching. That much, at least, doesn't require a satellite dish.